them in the drawer, and I found them in the same drawer 45 years later in 1980. Well, I took them to the National Film Archives in London and had them edited down to half the original length, and now we show it here many times a day. Well, here they are, going on board the ship in Dover in the southeast of England just after Christmas in January 1935. The ship was called the Simon Bolivar. This is the baggage being taken on board and some flowers for one of the women passengers. It was, in fact, one of the first ships to be sunk in the Second World War when it hit a mine in the English Channel, and quite a lot of Barbadians lost their lives on it. No small basket of flowers, and here they are sailing across the Atlantic. The journey took 2 weeks, and the first class return fare was £50. And when you think they had to feed you for 2 weeks out and 2 weeks back, either the money was very good or the food was very bad. I'm not quite sure which. Somebody's feet well wrapped up in a blanket on the left there, and here it is getting a little bit rougher. In fact, the steward is inviting my grandfather to move in case he gets wet. Now here you see lifeboat drill. One day in 1987 we were watching this film and suddenly there was a scream from a woman in the middle of the room. We all wondered what on earth had happened, but we soon discovered she was that little girl having her lifeboat adjusted, and she recognized herself on the film. And here's the dinner gong announcing luncheon. And how's this for a swimming pool? On the left you'll see the ship's photographer, but all he gets is a wet camera. And deck games. When you arrived in Bridgetown, there was no deep water harbour to go to. The ship would anchor in the bay, and here you see a lighter which would be brought up beside the ship, and everything, including your baggage, would be lowered into the lighter. That's my grandfather with a hat on, and a rowing boat coming to collect the passengers. And if you look in the top left corner of this shot here, you'll see what was called Pelican Island, and that's where the deep water harbour is today. You get into a rowing boat, you'll be rowed into the careenage in the middle of Bridgetown, and you disembark at the customs shed. And this shows scenes around the careenage in those days. This is animal feed being imported. Notice the old donkey carts. No such thing as a container in those days. And the bridge after which the town was named. And he didn't like being filmed, so he threw himself to the deck. And here's wood being imported. Notice the old white fellow on the left, he's counting the wood. An early bus, and a couple of cars. And another view of the careenage. And pottery from Chalky Mount, part of the island not far from Nicholas Abbey. The barrels in which they ship molasses. Another view of the bridge. And that's how they moved barrels around Bridgetown in those days. If one fell off, they all fell off. You couldn't stop them. And the harbour police. A game called Warri, brought over from Africa in the days of slavery. It's still played a little. And this shows sugar being exported in sacks and rum being exported in barrels. Always in a barrel in those days, never in a bottle. The reason for it was quite simple. Of course, it matured more in a barrel, and therefore it became more valuable. And yet it is being loaded into a lighter to be taken out to the ship anchored in the bay for export. And next you see a couple of gentlemen who had a little bit too much of it. And on the left an English battleship, and on the right a cruise ship. These tall cabbage palm trees were mostly blown down by Hurricane Janet in 1955. And this is the fish market in Spikestown. Notice how everybody in Barbados wore hats in those days. It was considered to be impolite to be seen in public without a hat on your head. And more barrels being taken through Bridgetown. And Broad Street, the main shopping street, which in those days was two-way traffic, but today it's one-way. Notice the white planter crossing the road here now in his pith helmet. and rum being taken through Spikestown, a buggy, and these overhanging houses which you see here in Church Street, Spikestown, have mostly been knocked down by passing vehicles in recent years. This is a Morby woman. She's got a drink called Morby in the can on her head. She's holding a tap in her right hand and filling a mug in her left hand. She's about to sell it to the lady on the right who's a peanut vendor, and she's got the peanuts on a tray on her head, and there she is drinking the Morby. And Sunday school from the village of Mile and a Quarter, not far from here. And the bread van with the umbrella to keep the sun off his head, and the postman. Both the bread and the mail were delivered fresh every day. And here you see the Mahogany Avenue at the entrance to the plantation. And here now are scenes of Nicholas Abbey. This is a view of the house. And the maid. And these are my grandparents in the middle of the picture, and the manager of the plantation and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Clark Holman, on the outside. And some oxen about to pull one of the cane carts into the yard. And a horse being led in from the very building you're now sitting in, which used to be the stables in those days, and that's my father about to get onto the horse. The manager of the plantation would give out his orders to the workers first thing every morning. He'd then get on his horse and ride round the plantation to see what was going on. And here you see him in the foreground with my father in the background. And these are the men who worked in the silk factory in the yard. Now notice how young some of them are, because a boy or girl would leave school at the age of 11 in those days and go straight to work in what they call the third-class gang, which was really an agricultural apprentices gang, and they'd work their way up into the second-class gang at the age of 16 and the first-class gang at the age of 18. And here now is the third-class gang going out with cane plants neatly stacked in baskets on their heads to drop them in the field for the men to plant. Notice again how young they are. Some are boys and some are girls. And that's the overseer in charge of the party on the horse behind. And the women hoeing in the field, the practice which is still done today. And here are the canes being cut, exactly as they would have been cut 300 years ago. The men would cut them and lay them on the ground. The women would pick them up and carry them across to the cane cart on the right of the picture and hand them up to two men standing in the cart. And they would stack them vertically in the cart, not horizontally as done today. The reason for it is quite simple. When the cart came into the yard, they would tip the cart up because there was no hoist to lift the canes out, and the canes would fall out. But if they were lying horizontally on the bottom and they tipped the cart up, the canes would only fall back into the cart again. And here the canes being put into the cart, and when the cart was full it would be brought into the yard and weighed on the weighbridge, which you see being done here, and then pulled up beside the old windmill wall on the right of this picture and tipped out at the entrance to the factory. Now we had a steam-driven factory here in those days which made silk, but there were still windmills in operation, and if you look in the top left corner of the next shot, you'll see a windmill turning. Now a windmill had four sails on it, the dark part of the sail being wood and the light part being canvas, so you could unfurl the canvas as if the wind was not very strong. The top of the windmill was known as the roundhouse, and the long arm on the left the tail tree, which was used to turn the roundhouse and thus the sail of the windmill into the wind in the morning and out again in the evening. It would take about 10 men to turn it into the wind. Notice the water pump windmill in the background. And here you see the manager of the plantation and his assistant walking across from left to right, wearing their white suits and pith helmets, the old traditional uniform of the plantation manager. And there the canes being laid on the trough prior to being fed through the rollers. Now you see here 3 horizontal rollers made of metal, one above and 2 underneath, which you can't really see, so the cane would be crushed twice as it went through. In the old days, prior to 1750, the rollers were vertical and made of wood, and if you look on the right of this picture, you'll see what would have been the centre of 3 vertical wooden rollers in those days, but here it is transferring the power into the roller on the left. And here again you see how the canes fall out when they're tipped up because they're standing vertically in the cart rather than horizontally. And there's a view of the tail tree, 2 large tree trunks bound together with metal bands in the middle. It looks a bit foreshortened there by the effect of the camera, but a big windmill would have a tail tree 100 feet long and the sails would be 100 feet in diameter. And the Barbados windmill was probably the heaviest windmill ever built in the world. Some donkeys being used to bring in the canes. Every animal was put to use when they were reaping the sugar cane. And there's a picture of innocence for you. One of the tricks the boys used to get up to in those days, believe it or not, would be to catch onto the sail of the windmill as it went past the ground and hang on and go right up over the top and down the other side and jump off again. You couldn't do it there, going too quickly. You could only do it when it was going slowly. But as you went up, you'd have to change your grip, or you'd be upside down when you got to the top and you'd fall off. And you wouldn't want to do that. And as you got down to the bottom on the other side again, you'd land on your head if you didn't change your grip, and you got near the bottom and you'd break your neck. And you wouldn't want to do that either. And if you didn't let go, you'd go around a second time, and you certainly wouldn't want to do that. Now you see scenes here at Nicholas Plantation, where, as I say, we had a steam engine, but the process was just the same. The men would carry the canes in on their head, lay them on the trough and feed them through the roller. But the rollers were turned by a steam engine, which was much more reliable than the windmill. You could start it up in January and run it day and night non-stop right the way through until the end of May, when you'd finish reaping the crop. That was, of course, provided it didn't break down. Made by Fletchers of Derby in England in 1880, it ran for 67 years until 1947. There's the juice going into one of the cooling tanks, and there it is being stirred. And there's a view of the factory with the steam engine above and the cooling tanks below. That would enable the juice to run downhill through the system. A bit of a leak there, and this shows the mud press being tightened. You get a lot of mud in sugar, and so you have to squeeze it to get all the juice out. And there the canes going through the rollers and being crushed. And the juice coming out underneath, and the surplus crushed cane known as bagasse would come out between the 2 top rollers, be picked up by women in large baskets and carried on their heads into the yard and laid out in the sun to dry. And when it was dry, it would be put into the boiler to fire the boiler. So it was still an economical process. There's the juice going into one of the boilers, and there it is being evaporated off. It also goes to these boiling pans known as teiches. Be boiled in the first one, ladled into the second one, boiled again, and ladled into the third one, and boiled again. Each teiche was smaller than the previous teiche to allow for the evaporated off content from the previous teiche. They'd evaporate off nearly 80% before it would turn into a syrup. That's my grandmother having a try with the ladle, and my aunt. There it is being ladled from one teiche to another, and there it is boiling in the teiche. Now on a plantation in those days, there were a lot of men with skills that don't exist on plantations today. Here you see the coopers making the barrels to put the syrup in. And there were carpenters and joiners and wheelwrights and stonemasons and millwrights. But of all those skills, the only one we really require today is occasionally a carpenter. But in those days, in what they called the out-of-crop season, they'd get everything ready for the coming reaping of the sugar cane, and in late January, all the men would go and cut the cane. Here's the manager getting into his buggy just outside here in the yard to go down to the bank on a Friday to draw the money to pay the wages. There were no banks outside Bridgetown in those days. It would take him 2 hours to get in and 2 hours to get back again. And here the wheelwright's about to make a wheel for a cane cart, a simple but nevertheless skilled process which had been in use for many centuries throughout the world. What you did was you got a wooden wheel and laid it on the ground and a metal rim. Now the metal rim would be fractionally smaller than the wooden wheel. You place the metal rim in the fire, and that would heat it up and cause it to expand sufficiently to go over the wooden wheel. You'd then pull it out of the fire with a hook, pick it up with tongs, place it over the wooden wheel, knock it on with sledgehammers and stand it up in the water, and that would cool it and cause the rim to contract tightly onto the wheel. These are the largest wheels we made here in those days, and here now is the whole process. The metal rim is being heated up in the fire, pulled out with a hook, picked up with tongs and placed over the wooden wheel. You had to be pretty quick for 2 reasons. Firstly, the rim would cool and contract and you might not get the wheel on, or the rim on. And secondly, it would still be pretty hot and it would still burn the wheel which you wouldn't want to damage. So you knocked it off with sledgehammers as quickly as possible. You can see the smoke rising off it now. And then you would pick it up, being careful not to burn your hands or arms on the hot rim, wheel it over to a small hole which you previously dug in the ground and filled with water, and that would quench the fire and cool the rim and cause the rim to contract tightly on the wheel. Then when you've done that, you'd place the wheel on the cart, lock it so it wouldn't turn, and drag the cart through the yard with the wheel locked. If the rim stayed on, you'd made a good one, but if it came off, you'd made a bad one, and you'd have to start all over again. And here they are starting again. You dig a hole and take the sand out of the wheel, lay the wheel down, heat the rim up in the fire, pull it out with a hook, pick it up with tongs, carry it over and place it over the wooden wheel, knock it on with sledgehammers, and stand it up and place it in the water. And if you look at the right rear wheel in the next shot, as they drag the cart through the yard, you'll see the wheel's not going round. That's the test to see if the rim would stay on. And if the rim stayed on, you would knock four bolts through the rim into the wheel, and bolt the rim to the wheel. It would last you for many years, much longer than Mr. Goodyear's tires will last you today. And then in the 1920s, they built these large refractories, one of which you see here, called Spring Hall in St. Lucie. And they put our small syrup factory out of business, and we closed it down in 1947 and sold it for scrap. A couple of shots of the next generation of Barbadians who are now all grown up. And then when you finished your trip to Barbados, there was no international airport to go to, no deep water harbour. You went back down to the Careenage in the middle of Bridgetown, and you got into a rowing boat, and you were rowed out to your ship, and you sailed away. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the film.